This title is narrated with virtual voice, computer-generated narration for audiobooks. Apache Gunhawk by Chad Cole and Franklin Lincoln. Chapter 1. Billowing dark clouds, roiling and churning in searing wind, seemed to zoom across the jagged mountain peaks of the Mogollons, long dark entrails streaming behind them and meshing with the black mass of the onrushing storm and obliterating the gray-blue of the early morning New Mexico sky. Rain began to drip from the leading clouds, soon to be joined by the pelting torrent of water streaming violently from the ensuing storm mass. Rolling thunder rumbled in the distance. A huge bolt of lightning sliced through the clouds, followed by a tremendous crack of thunder, with another flash of lightning slicing through the dark sky almost immediately, before the next deafening roar. 8 riders had emerged from a stand of trees at the base of the Mogollon mountain range, pushing their mounts steadily forward into the driving rain as the lightning bathed them in its momentary glow. The rain dripping off their wide hat brims and down the dark slickers that attempted to shield them from the brunt of the storm added to the general discontent and grimness of their purpose. The leader of the group rode slightly ahead, and at the center of the pack, rain dripping off the thin line of silvery gray beard that bristled along his pudgy jawline and chin. He was a big man, with a burly frame and aging well into his 50s. His face had turned flabby, and his jowls framed the gash of a mouth that turned downward at each end into a snarling scowl. Hell, how did I get this old this soon? Ace Noonan grimaced to himself as he rode. It was already spring of 1855, and he still had nothing more than a life of bank robberies and stage holdups, with only a band of low-life followers and a hideaway in the Colorado mountains for refuge between jobs. He was particularly disgruntled this day, not just because of the storm, although that added to his temper, but because this whole job had a sour taste to it. Things had started to go wrong the day before when they came across a peaceful hunting party of Jicarillo Apaches. "Looky, looky," Charlie Noonan had said as he reined his horse to a halt, turning his mount crosswise on the trail and blocking passage for the rest of the gang as they were climbing toward the rim of a canyon. He pointed out the band of 5 Indians riding slowly below. A deer was slung across the back of one of the ponies. "Let's have us some fun and get us a couple of red sticks," Charlie chuckled as he wheeled his horse around and dragged his rifle from its scabbard. "Leave 'em be," Ace bellowed, pushing his horse into the side of Charlie's. "It's a hunting party. They're not looking for trouble, and we don't need any. When are you ever going to grow up, kid?" Ace scolded his younger brother of 12 years. "Since when did you get to be an Injun lover, Ace?" Charlie retorted, a look of disappointment on his lean, craggy face. "Never mind," Ace growled. "Leave them alone. Come on, we've still got miles to cover before nightfall. Let's go." Ace led his horse out around his brother to continue on up the trail, the rest of the gang following behind, shoving Charlie to the side of the trail, leaving him to bring up the rear. Charlie grinned from ear to ear, revealing his yellowed and uneven large teeth. He would have his fun anyways. In spite of Ace's warning, whipping his horse around, he brought the rifle up and leveled it at the young Apache buck bringing up the rear of the party. Ace raged with fury when the roar of Charlie's rifle echoed in his ears. By the time he managed to rein his mount around, the rifle had barked 2 more times. He could see 3 red bodies lying on the ground below. The 2 remaining bucks and their horses galloped away, leaving their fallen brothers behind. The incident still gnawed at Ace as he rode on through the rain. He had tried to raise his younger brother right, but something about Charlie was just not right. Perhaps a bit addled in the head, or perhaps he was just mean. Although he had tried, Ace just could not control him. And now the damage had been done. It didn't take much to incite the Apache these days. The whole Southwest was fast becoming a boiling pot of danger. Hopefully, whatever trouble that would ensue from yesterday's incident would not start until they had accomplished their business in this area and made tracks back to Colorado and the sanctuary of the Wolf's Lair, as it was called, hidden deep in the mountains south of Denver. The Noonan gang never pulled jobs close to home. Never had they stolen anything within Colorado. Always they would ride far from home, south to Arizona and New Mexico, and north as far as Wyoming and the Dakotas. They would strike once and quickly and return home to lie low for a while. So far, this tactic had kept them alive and free of the law. Sometimes Ace was amazed that it had worked so well for so long, but at times he wondered if and when his luck might run out. And now the business at hand was more difficult due to the raging storm, which showed no sign of let up before they reached their destination at Mud Flats. With grim determination, Ace Noonan led his men onward. The bank at Mud Flats was holding Army payroll for the men at Fort Union, and the usual detail of cavalry would be there to pick it up that afternoon. The Noonan gang needed to be in and out of Mud Flats before noon with the loot, and be well on their way home before the cavalry arrived. The pelting rain had slowed them down considerably, adding to frustration and the grimness of their task. Ace began to think perhaps he was getting too old for this life, but once on the outlaw trail, it was difficult to give it up. There just didn't seem to be any place else to go, no other kind of life to lead. His wife, Eleanor, had lived with him these many years in the Wolf's Lair and had put up with being cut off from the outside world. She had never complained and had always stood steadfastly at his side until she died of pneumonia a year and a half ago. Ace no longer found a purpose to his life. All that kept him going now was his son Bill. Bill rode next to his father on the right. He was a tall, strapping young man and sat the saddle with an air of authority and confidence. Ace was proud of the boy. Boy? Hell, he was a full-grown man with a wife and family of his own. Still, Bill was his boy, and he was proud of the capable young man he had grown into. Next to Ace's right-hand man, Sid Denglard, who rode to the bandit boss's left as he had for the last 15 years, Bill was the most level-headed member of the gang and almost as proficient with a horse and gun as Sid. Ace didn't know what he did differently for Bill to turn out this way when he had had no success with his younger brother. He guessed that Charlie was just defective, and there was nothing he could have done differently for him to turn out any different. Bill and Sid had both kept quiet since the incident with the Apache hunting party. They could feel Ace's anger and left him to his own morose temper as they kept their mounts abreast of their leader. Bill had his own thoughts and was downright worried. He had never seen his father scared before, but he could sense that the old man was actually frightened, as if he had a premonition of impending doom. And if Ace was scared, then Bill knew he should be too. Bill's wife, Virginia, had implored Bill to give up the gang before something bad might happen. Somehow she felt the time was near, as if she too had a premonition. Bill had shrugged her concerns off, blaming them on the fact that she no longer wanted the confines of Wolf's Lair and longed for the excitement and company of the outside world. He could understand her loneliness, especially when he was away on a job. Virginia had coped with it all much better when his mother was alive. She had been a great companion to Virginia, and the two were like mother and daughter. But since Eleanor's passing, Virginia became more discontented and irritable. Even with the arrival of baby Bill, Virginia was still not content, but caring for the child seemed to give her new purpose and took the edge off being alone. She still took every opportunity to talk her husband into taking them away from the outlaw stronghold and live an ordinary life. Bill wanted desperately to please his wife, but as long as his father needed him with the gang, he was compelled to stay on. He knew if he ever brought the issue up to Ace, the old man would tell him to go live his life, so he never would approach the topic with his father. But now, as Bill felt the elder Noonan's edginess over the current job, he began to think that perhaps Virginia was right. Perhaps this way of life was no longer suitable, even to Ace Noonan. Perhaps he should call it quits with this job. That is, if everything went as planned in Mud Flats. Somehow, this day held a foreboding of impending disaster that seemed unshakable. With silent grimness, the band of riders pushed on through the darkness and pounding rain, riding toward the destiny that awaited them. Jean Lafarge slouched lazily in his chair on the front porch of his daughter's and son-in-law's cabin. He whittled idly on a stick with his knife and gazed out across the valley toward the setting sun. The giant golden orb splayed fingers of light against the backdrop of the hills to the west. The streaming rays were particularly misty this afternoon after the torrential rains earlier in the day. A misty fog steamed off the wet grass as it dried in what was left of the day's sun. As the setting sun settled lower behind the valley wall, the old man thought he saw a movement on the hill. He forgot his whittling and sat erect, pulled his pipe from his lips, and began chewing on one corner of his gray flowing handlebar mustache. Was he seeing things? He thought. Must be, he told himself, but then he caught the movement again. He squinted into the setting sun, and as its last rays of light settled beneath the horizon, he saw it again. He jumped to his feet, dropping his whittling and pipe at the sudden realization of what was out there. Horses and riders moved out onto the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the golden glow of sundown. Then more appeared behind them. They were not just any riders. They were Apaches. Lafarge had seen Indians before, but they were usually a few young bucks on a hunt. This time there were a great many of them, and several wore the headdress of a war chief. So far since he had stayed with his family, here in this lonely valley, there had been no sign of hostiles, but he had heard stories about the Army's treatment of Apaches and the growing unrest among the tribes. It had been peaceful here, and Jean Lafarge was comfortable living with his daughter and her husband. Now he was frightened, and his knees trembled. Oh, how he wished Claudine's husband had not taken that part-time job in town. Oh, how he wished he were here right now. The band of Indians began to descend from the top of the hill, moving steadily, slowly, and silently with deliberate approach. The old man backed slowly to the door, keeping his eyes on the approaching hostiles. He reached behind him and opened the door. Then, with a sudden move, he dashed inside and slammed the door behind him, holding it shut as he leaned his narrow back against it. His eyes were bulging with fear, and his breathing was fast and deep. "Papa," his daughter exclaimed, as she turned around from the kitchen tub and saw father in a state of panic. She was a slender, small-framed young woman with long raven black hair and large round dark eyes. "What's wrong?" At first he could say nothing. Then, as he gathered himself, he gasped. "Apaches, they're headed this way." "But Papa, we've had no trouble with the Apaches before. It's probably just a hunting party." "Not this time, daughter," he choked it out. "It's a war party." "It can't be," she said calmly, and moved toward the front window. "No!" Lafarge shouted. "Stay away from the window." She had already parted the linen curtains. Her breath caught suddenly, her nonchalance evaporating instantly and replaced by sudden fear. "My God!" she uttered. "They are coming this way." The band of warriors had already reached the valley and were headed toward the cabin. She let the curtains fall and dropped back from the window. "Oh, Papa, what shall we do?" "I don't know," he muttered with his broken English and French accent. "I wish your husband was here." "So do I," she said. "He'd know what to do. Why did he have to take that awful job in town? We could have gotten by on our own out here without it." "Do not be harsh against him, Claudine. Your husband is quite a man. He is only thinking about taking care of you and little Tommy." "I know, but we need him now," she wailed. The old man began to realize that his daughter and the baby had only himself to rely on now. It would still be some time before Claudine's husband returned. He began to try to calm himself. He had to bring his own fears under control. He had to think more clearly now. What would his son-in-law do? Then he remembered the rifle hanging above the door jamb. He stepped away from the door, turned to face it. There it was. He reached up and pulled it down. He fumbled with it nervously, trying to figure out how to use it. It was a simple mechanism, a single-shot breech loader. He reached above the door frame once more and found a box of shells. Some of them spilled out and clattered to the floor as he nervously pushed several rounds into his trouser pockets and then one into the breech. He let the bolt snap shut, sliding the cartridge into place, and darted to the window, pulling the curtains back slightly to peer out. His heart leaped in his throat as he saw the hostiles approach the other side of the corral and barn. Then, as if on cue, the window shattered over his head as a feathered arrow shot through and embedded in the log wall behind him. Then, with a whoop, the party shot forward at a gallop, shrill war cries breaking the stillness of the approaching twilight. The old man, in terrified rage, slung the muzzle of the rifle over the sill of the broken window, and with his eyes squeezed shut, he jerked the trigger. The weapon boomed in his hands, and he staggered back a step from the impact of the recoil. His eyes opened, and he threw himself back against the wall beneath the window. Then, mustering his courage, he reloaded and raised the weapon, thrusting it through the opening once more. Once again the rifle roared. This time he kept his eyes open, and to his surprise, he saw a warrior fall from his horse and lie still on the ground. He felt a sudden elation, then ducked low and crammed another round into the breech. As he arose once more to fire, a flaming arrow sliced through the air over his head and landed on the kitchen table. The tablecloth immediately whipped into flame. Claudine screamed and instinctively reached for the water bucket that was still 3/4 full, since bringing in water from the well just before supper time. She sloshed the liquid over the burning table, then picked up a blanket and beat the remaining flames out. His father, momentarily stunned, had taken his attention away from the window. As Claudine beat out the last of the flames, she glanced toward the old man and the open window behind him. "Papa!" she shouted, pointing toward the window. He whirled just in time to see a red face at the window. Without thought, he brought the rifle up and fired point blank at the attacker. Blood splashed across the windowsill, and the warrior fell back out of sight. The old man stepped back to the window. A cloud of smoke outside impaired his vision, and for the first time, he realized that the cabin was completely on fire from flaming arrows embedded in the outside walls. He fired haphazardly, hoping to do some damage. "Daughter!" he shouted over his shoulder. "They are burning us out. You must get the baby and go to the root cellar and try to get out. I will hold them off as long as I can." "No, Papa!" she screamed. "I cannot go without you." "You must!" he shouted without turning around to look at her. He fired through the window again. "Think of the baby! Go! It's not much of a chance anyways." He reloaded and fired again. Claudine knew her father was right. Until then, she had not thought about the child, but now she could hear the baby crying in his crib. "Go!" the old man implored her over his shoulder as he kept firing. "I'll be along if I can. Just get yourself and the baby as far away as you can." She ran to the baby's crib and lifted him into her arms, wrapping his blankets tightly around him. Debris from the rafters fell on her shoulders, and she glanced upward to see smoke pouring through a gaping hole where fire had burned through the roof. The baby was crying loudly in her ears, but it muted into the sound of the Indians' shrill war cries from outside and the booming sound of Lafarge's rifle. She ran quickly to the back of the cabin, pulled the door to the root cellar open, and stumbled down the wooden stairs into the dank darkness. Had she not left the door open behind her, she would have needed a lantern, but with some light from above, and her own familiarity with the cellar, she found her way to the outer entrance, where 4 steps upwards would take her to the ground-level outside door. The sounds from above in the cabin were somewhat dimmed now due to the thickness of the earth around her. As she neared the door, she prayed that her husband had not padlocked it from the outside. Holding the screaming baby in one arm, she pushed upward on the wooden door. It lifted free. Light filtered through the cracks around it. Good. It was not locked. She pushed the lid higher, just enough to peer out. The war cries were louder now, from the front of the cabin, but as she gazed out into the twilight, she could see no Apaches on this side of the cabin. Quickly, she heaved the door upward, and it fell flat open against the ground. She then clasped one hand over the baby's mouth to stifle his screaming, and ran out of the cellar into the shadows toward the thicket some 25 yards away. She ran with a stagger, her breathing labored, and she sobbed desperately, clutching the baby's mouth tighter. So tight that the child's squirming ceased, and his face turned beet red. "Oh God," she told herself, "don't let me smother my own baby." It seemed like it took forever to reach the thicket. Almost as if everything had slowed down and every step was in slow motion, all the while expecting to be caught by an attacking Apache. Finally, she slid to the ground behind a bush at the edge of the thicket. Her legs could take her no farther. She laid the baby down on the new spring grass next to her and pulled her hand away from its face. The tiny child lay very still, motionless, eyes closed. "Oh no," she sobbed. "Have I killed him? I can't have. Don't let it be." She examined him closer. Is he breathing? She couldn't tell. Her own chest was heaving, gulping for air, and she couldn't distinguish if it was her own movement or that the baby actually did move on its own. She lifted the baby in her arms, cradling him and shaking him violently, willing the child to be alive. Then, as if seeing it for the first time, she looked back toward the cabin. It was brilliantly alight with raging fire now, and the rifle fire had stopped. "Papa," she thought with a shudder. "He's still in there. He'll die in the fire, or is he already dead? No, it can't be." Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught as she saw the old man emerging from the root cellar and starting to run toward the thicket. Thank God, she thought. Then, in another heartbeat, an Apache rider appeared, galloping his pony around the far corner of the cabin. Before she could scream a warning, the warrior was already bearing down on the running old man. With spear in hand, the brave thrust it deep into Lafarge's bony back. His eyes bulged, his knees bent, and he fell to the ground in a heap. The warrior pulled his lance free, danced his horse around in a circle, and holding his lance skyward in victory, he let out a shrill whoop and then kicked his horse in the ribs to ride back to the front of the cabin and join the other warriors. "No!" Claudine screamed as she put the baby down, pushed herself to her feet, and ran out of the thicket toward her fallen father. She fell to her knees beside him and rolled him over. His eyes were wide open, staring upward and lifeless at her. She let his body fall back, blood dripping on her hands and dress, unable to move from the shock. All sound seemed to cease as delirium began to overtake her. She didn't seem to hear the pounding of horses' hooves behind her as two young bucks rode down on her, one on each side, reaching down and each grasping her under her arms and lifting her from the ground. She made no sound, nor did she attempt to fight them off as they carried her off between them into the darkening night. In another moment, the war party was gone, leaving the cabin in smoldering flames. Once again, all was quiet in the valley. Not a sound could be heard, not even a bird or hoot owl. And then, a lonely sound broke the stillness, the sound of a baby crying, alone in the wilderness. Chapter 2. It was a band of beleaguered riders that rode into the darkness of the valley that night. Tired, worn horses stepped unsteadily down the slick, wet grass-covered hill that brought them close to the remains of the burned cabin. Ace Noonan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, trying to ease the pain. Blood dripped off his fingers as it oozed out from the cuff of his sleeve. His massive head lolled forward against his chest, and a glaze was building up over his eyes. They were a tired group of riders, feeling almost defeated. Sure, they had gotten the money they went after, but they had paid a price. 2 men had been left dead, blood soaking in the mud at Mud Flats. There were only 6 of them left now, and 2 were wounded. Cliff Bean was only slightly hurt, his left arm bandaged where a bullet had sliced the meaty portion of his upper arm. Ace had been hurt, but no one knew how bad, for he would not complain, and he tried to hide it from the rest. But Bill and Sid knew the old man was hit harder than what he let on, while he kept his men moving northward. The driving rain had let up considerably by the time the Noonan gang had ridden into Mud Flats. The town lived up to its name as the streets were a sea of mud. The sky was still very dark with cloud cover, but the rain was now just a drizzle. The streets were empty of travel, and although it was near noontime, it was still dark enough from the storm that lights flickered inside the buildings. The riders had drawn rein at the edge of town and surveyed the territory. The town was quiet, no one on the streets to see them ride in. Still, to be cautious, they would separate into 3 groups, as was their usual strategy. Ace, Sid, and Cliff Bean rode in first, passed by the saloon and tied up in front of the bank, removed their saddlebags and carried them inside. Charlie Noonan, Sam Deal, and Pug Taylor followed after a couple of minutes. They rode past the first trio and stopped in front of the hardware store, a little further up the street. Bill Noonan and Pete Gell then rode in and stopped in front of the saloon. They remained in their saddles, watching the street. After a few moments, the door to the bank opened and Cliff Bean stepped through, gun in hand surveying the street, then motioned to the others behind him. He stepped down off the plank sidewalk, leaving room for Ace and Sid to back through the door, with bulging saddlebags draped over their left forearms, while keeping their guns on the people inside the bank. Once out onto the sidewalk, Sid slammed the door shut, and they both turned to their horses. A shot rang out from across the street. Cliff Bean yelped with pain and surprise as a bullet tore into his arm and spun him around, dropping him into the mud. Instinctively, Ace and Sid fired back in the general direction where the shot had come from. They saw no one, but they were sure there was someone in the alley between the barber shop and the mercantile. They fired rapidly, pounding lead into the corners of the buildings on each side of the alley, while Cliff arose to his feet and struggled to mount his horse. The other members of the gang wheeled their horses and joined in on the firing. A rifle blast sounded twice from atop the livery. The first slug whizzed close to Charlie Noonan's head, and with the second shot, Sam Deal flew backwards from the saddle into the mud, blood spreading across his chest. Charlie whipped his mount around and saw a blue uniformed soldier on the roof of the livery fire again. Then, as he saw Pug Taylor take a slug in the head from the cavalryman's weapon, he fired back. The soldier stumbled backwards a step, dropped his rifle, and clutched at his chest just before his knees sagged. He pitched forward off the roof and splashed into the mud. Meanwhile, Ace and Sid were making their way to the horses, firing haphazardly at first, seeing no one. As they climbed into their saddles, a soldier appeared from the alley, firing his rifle and pistol rapidly as he came. Bill Noonan from up the street opened fire, giving cover. The soldier, momentarily distracted, swung his rifle toward the returning fire, giving Ace the opportunity to send fire back. The soldier's rifle flew into the air as he pitched backward into the street. As the frenzied band of outlaws grouped into a riding mass, a young man wearing a lawman's star raced out of the livery, firing wildly as the bandits raced past him. Ace slumped in the saddle as hot lead tore into his side. But with sheer determination, he righted himself, turned in the saddle, and fired once more. The young lawman felt the impact of the bullet tearing into his left hip and sprawled face first into the mud. The lawman quickly pushed himself up on his hands, rising just enough to lift his pistol. With rain and mud dripping in his eyes, the fleeing band of outlaws was just a blur. He squeezed off a shot just as a trooper ran into the street, firing his service revolver after the bank robbers. Nausea poured over the lawman as he realized the trooper had run in the way of his bullet. Blood flowered on the back of the soldier's tunic, and he fell, face down in the street. The lawman, full of remorse and defeat, let his pistol fall, and then let his body fall with despair, back into the oozing mud. A gold-plated pocket watch had fallen from his vest and lay open in the muddy street. The picture of the young lawman and his wife on their wedding day was splattered and streaked with mud. The Noonan gang continued at breakneck speed, endangering their mounts as they slipped and slid in the slushy mud and later on, slick west grass as they rode into the mountains to the north. As the day wore on, the storm had completely subsided and the sky began to clear with the sun finally breaking through the clearing clouds. The tired band had pushed their horses to the limit and were finally forced to stop for a rest next to a secluded mountain stream that trickled through the pass they had just ridden through. Here they rested their horses briefly, watered them, filled their canteens, and pushed on. Ace, notably, had not dismounted during the stop, probably for fear of not being able to remount. His orders were short and gruff, with little else to say. So far, Apache did not seem to be close on their trail, but they all knew that even if they had left any able-bodied men in town who might take after them, they had probably been discouraged by the sound of Apache war drums beating in the hills and smoke signal rising from the distant bluffs north of town. Just as Ace had feared, Charlie's little attack on a peaceful hunting party had probably touched off a fuse that had just been waiting to be lit. Although they saw no sign of hostiles all day, other than the smoke and drums, they knew the country had now come alive with danger and destruction. As the party of men rode into the valley, they could smell the ashes of the cabin up ahead, long before they saw the smoldering cabin remnants and the stench of death. Knowing that the Indians had already been here and gone, assured the gang that this might be a good place to stop. There was a stone well standing in what had been the front yard of the cabin. They could get water here, possibly hole up for a while and rest before moving on before daylight. As they rode up to the well, Ace was hanging on to the pommel of his saddle, doubled up, leaning over his horse's neck. His face was ashen, and his eyes were glazed over as he tried to pull his mount to a halt. Then, as if reaching his goal was all he was hanging on for, his bloody hands slipped from the saddle horn, and the big man's body fell out of the saddle and onto the ground. Bill leaped from his saddle, ran to his father's side, and rolled him over on his back. Sid hurried to the well, found a bucket tied to a rope, and dropped it into the water below. Then started cranking the bucket full of water back up. Bill had pulled Ace to a half-sitting position, cradling him in his arms, by the time the others had dismounted and gathered around, staring at their fallen leader gasping for breath. Sid squeezed himself in and squatted beside Ace. He dipped a dipper into the bucket and brought it up to Ace's lips. The outlaw leader pulled his head away, refusing it. "The gang's yours now, son," the elder Noonan rasped feebly as his life ebbed away. His eyes fluttered, then froze into an unseen stare into Sid Dengler's face. Bill pulled his father to his chest and choked on a stifled sob. Sid poured the dipper back into the bucket and set it aside. He placed his gnarled hand on Bill's shoulder and said softly, "He's gone, boy. Let it go. Let him go." Bill held on for a moment longer, then he let the old man's body down to the ground. Sid reached out and brushed Ace's eyelids shut. He now looked like he was sleeping. "They knew we were coming, didn't they, Sid?" Bill said bitterly. "I'm afraid so, son," Sid answered quietly. "But how?" "I don't know, boy," Sid replied. I just don't know." "I won't rest until I find out, Sid," Bill oathed. "I'll make them pay for this." At that moment, Bill Noonan knew that any previous thoughts of leaving the gang could no longer be entertained. His life was just what it was, and now he was leader of the Wolf's Lair gang, and he would carry on in his father's place. "Sure, kid," Sid reassured him, But now, don't you think we'd better take care of him?" "I guess you're right," Bill said reluctantly. "But I hate to leave him out here in the wild." "I rode with your pa for a good many years, son. I'm sure he would find the valley a nice place to rest for all eternity." Then to the other men, Sid said, "Look around and see if you can find a shovel or something we can use to dig a grave." After a search of the grounds, a fire-rusted shovel had been found in what was left of the barn. In addition, the search had turned up the body of Jean Lafarge, and both bodies were planted in shallow graves, which they dug beneath a white oak tree. There would be no marker for either man. Lafarge was unknown to them, and Ace Noonan would have to remain unknown to the rest of the world. Dawn was starting to approach when the work was completed. Bill stood silently, head bowed, hat in his hand, as he bid a final farewell to the man who had raised him and had meant so much to him. A slight breeze tugged at his dark hair, and a shock fell into his misty eyes. Then, with resolve, he placed his hat back on his head and turned to see his men already saddled and ready to ride. Sid held his horse for him while he stepped into the stirrup and started to swing up. That's when he heard it. He stepped back to the ground and looked off across the valley. He listened intently. Then he heard it again. At first, he thought it was the soft moan of the wind, but it couldn't be. The breeze was too mild. Was it the sound of a lonesome coyote? Or was it the wail of ancient spirits? No. The sound was clearer now, and he knew exactly what it sounded like. But it couldn't be. Not out here in the lonely wilderness with no one else around. Then he heard it again, and looking at his men, he knew they heard it too, and they too were just as sure as he what it was. It was the sound of a baby crying. They found the baby lying in the thicket wrapped in a blanket that had the name, Tommy, embroidered in red around its silky border. Bill cradled the infant in his arms and tucked the baby's blanket tightly around the child and carried him back toward the horses. "What are you going to do with him?" Sid asked. Bill's thoughts were already racing. "I'm going to keep him, Sid," he answered quietly. This might just be what Virginia would need to keep her complacent. Another child to care for. He knew she wanted more children, but after the hard time with little Bill's birth, they had decided it wouldn't be worth the risk to try for another. Especially once she found out that Bill was now in charge of the gang, she might fear she was trapped in the wolf's lair for good. But now that he was boss, perhaps he could run the gang differently. Perhaps he could maintain a respectable home in a city somewhere when he was not on a job. It just could work. Besides, with Sid to help him and be in charge when he was not around, it seemed like a viable idea. He wasn't sure how Sid was taking it that Ace had not turned the gang over to him. And making Sid almost an equal partner might soothe any ill feelings. "Keep him?" Charlie Noonan piped up. "You can't bring a baby along with us. He'll just be trouble and he'll slow us down. Just you forget that kind of nonsense and let's get away from here before the law or Apaches catch up to us." "We're getting out of here all right," Bill said irritably. "But the baby's going with us." "Oh no," Charlie seethed. "I say no." "You've got no say, Charlie." "Oh, yes, I have," Charlie grinned wryly. "With Ace gone, that makes me in charge now." "Ace turned the gang over to Bill just before he cashed in," Sid chimed in. "I heard him." "That can't be," Charlie snarled. "I'm his brother." "I guess a son outranks a brother, Charlie," Sid drawled with a slight smile. "Outranks an old friend too," he added. Then to Bill, "As it should be, son." He smiled, and Bill knew that Sid was okay with the new command. Chapter 3. Virginia was thrilled with the arrival of the new baby, but not with the news that Bill was now leader of the gang. That, along with hearing of the close calls during the last raid and Ace's death, her fears of something happening to her husband were doubled. He tried to convince her that this had been a happenstance, and he would not let anything like that happen again. Ace had been getting old and perhaps had gotten a little careless. He should have called off the job as soon as things started to go wrong. He assured Virginia that he would never make that mistake, but she didn't fully buy it. Then he presented his plan to her, that they would move into Denver. He would change his name and present himself as a traveling salesman. This would explain absences away from his family for prolonged periods. Meanwhile, Virginia and the kids could live comfortably and respectably as a part of an upper-class society. The boys could go to good schools and grow up to be something other than what he and his father had been. He would always keep the gang life separate, and the boys would never ever hear of, nor see the Wolf's Lair. She was skeptical at first, but when they settled in the city as Bill and Virginia Nolan, with their two little boys, Bill Jr., or Little Bill as they liked to refer to him, and their younger boy, Tommy, she began to believe that it just might work. They bought a large white frame house and a well-to-do neighborhood. Bill took on roles of leadership in various civic organizations, and Virginia became very much involved in several social events, becoming acquainted with other women from the upper crust of Denver society. Bill would go away from time to time on his so-called sales trips and come home with enough money to continue keeping up with the neighbors. He never spoke of the Wolf's Lair members of the gang or what he did while he was away. After a while, Virginia began to almost believe that they were a normal family, living a normal life. As the boys grew older and went to school, Virginia was becoming very satisfied with her life. She no longer feared danger to her husband and was no longer uncomfortable around people of authority, such as police and officers of the court. In fact, they were friends with many who served in those professions. It began to feel as if the days of hiding and fear of the law was far behind them. The boys grew like weeds and kept her busy. No one doubted that the boys were not true brothers, although they had distinctively different personalities. Tom was quiet and shy, the serious, studious type in school, and Little Bill was a hell-raiser from day one and never cared for school. Yet the boys were good friends and got along well, even though Tom was always covering up for his older brother's mischievousness. But as all good things must eventually come to an end, the idyllic life of the Nolans could not last forever. One day, as the boys clambered out of the little one-room schoolhouse, in which they were in the 4th and 5th grades, respectively, they didn't notice the tall, lean man wearing a black frock coat and derby hat lounging against a tree on the other side of the schoolyard. The boys were laughing and giggling as they raced across the schoolyard to meet their parents, who had a habit of often strolling arm in arm along the shady lane toward school to meet the boys. As Bill dropped Virginia's arm and stepped away, both arms reaching out for the boys, the man stepped away from the tree, dragging a pistol from a shoulder holster under his coat. With Bill's attention on the boys, he didn't see the man, but Virginia caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. The man had his pistol up and leveled at Bill's head when she screamed. Bill flinched just as the weapon roared. Hot lead whizzed past his face, missing him by less than an inch. Virginia reached out for Bill as the pistol roared again. She felt the impact and sudden burning pain as she stepped in the way of the bullet. She sagged against her husband, and he fell to his knees, trying to hold her up. Wet, sticky blood oozed through her frilly dress and covered his hands. He looked up, just in time to see the assailant standing there with a smoking gun in hand. His cadaverous face was dark, and his eyes bulged with mixed fear and awe at what he had done. Instinctively, Bill reached under his coat where he would normally be wearing a gun when not at home. There was none, for Tom Nolan, respectable citizen, never wore one. He glared at the man and saw him turn and run away, his mission bungled. Bill didn't know him or why he was after him, but he would never forget his face. The boys were now crying and falling against their mother, screaming for her to be all right. Bill pushed the boys back, speaking low and reassuringly to them as he lowered Virginia's body to the grass. She smiled feebly for a half-second, looking up into Bill's face, then died quietly. There was no explanation for the attack, and the neighborhood was shocked. No one could understand why a nice couple, such as the Nolans, should be the target of an assassin. The general assumption was the man must have had robbery in mind. Beyond that, there just was no other explanation. There was a large turnout for Virginia's funeral. The boys were devastated and clung to their father as their mother was lowered into the ground. Although the community offered their condolences and sympathy, Bill knew it would be a matter of time before further investigation might ensue and eventually lead to the discovery of his true identity. Besides, what was he to do with the boys now? Without a mother to care for them while he was away tending to business, he must care for them himself. But how? There was only one way, and he knew Virginia would not have approved if she were there, but she wasn't there. He would have to do what he swore he would never do. Bill Nolan would sell his beautiful home in Denver and move away for good, never to be heard from again. Only Bill Noonan, feared leader of the Wolf's Lair gang, would carry on with his boys living with him in an outlaw stronghold. The boys adjusted to the new way of life quickly. They were at the age where bad memories faded quickly and were replaced with the attention of the other members of the gang and the wide open spaces to play in without having to go to school. Young Tom seemed to miss his schooling, but Bill saw to it that he was provided with reading material. Bill and Sid taught the boys how to ride a horse, handle a lariat, and follow a trail. Little Bill was particularly adept on picking up outdoor skills, and he looked up to the members of the gang and their ways. He was especially fond of his uncle Charlie Noonan. Charlie was now beginning to age, but still had a maturity similar to a young boy. Much to the elder Bill Noonan's chagrin, little Bill was fascinated by Charlie's exaggerated stories. He was eager to learn to use a gun, and his Uncle Charlie was quick to show him how. Bill Noonan was quick to put Charlie in his place, letting him know in uncertain terms that if the boys were to learn to use a gun, he would do the teaching himself. He wanted to make sure that the boys learned the proper respect for a shooting iron and to use it responsibly and appropriately. The boys grew up quickly, growing in skills and confidence there in the stronghold, and never seemed to mind being cut off from the outside world during the first few years, but as they grew older, they began to want to see what else might lie beyond the stronghold. By the time they were teenagers, they had honed the many skills of outdoor life and were rapidly coming to the age where they began to think they could contribute more than just carrying out the necessary chores that supported the outlaw gang. Both boys were now good shots and good trackers, and they were tiring of being left behind while the others rode off to adventure. They had taken care of the gardening, growing food for the men, and went out hunting, keeping the lair in meat supply. Little Bill's constant whining about being left behind aggravated Bill Noonan to all ends. When his patience finally gave out, he agreed against his own better judgment to let the boys accompany them and learn the ways of the trail. It was understood that the boy would not be involved in any of the jobs. They would merely be a support team that maintained temporary camps for them and hunt for game, keeping the outlaws supplied. It was on one of these trips that led into southern New Mexico that Tom Noonan first met up with the young Indian boy known as Hawk. Tom and Little Bill had been hunting and had just emerged from the woods onto a grassy knoll. Tom was leading his horse with the carcass of a deer slung across the saddle. Little Bill, astride his own horse, was carrying their current cache of game in a canvas sack tied to the saddle horn. It had not been a bad morning's work, and both lads were satisfied with what they had to bring back. It was here atop the knoll that the two brothers saw the young Apache boy scaling a gravel bank on the far side of the canyon, apparently gathering wild strawberries that grew abundantly there. He appeared to be a little younger than either Tom or Little Bill, but he looked like he was built solid and was very muscular. Above him, at the top of the gravel bank, the boys could see another Apache youth creeping through the rocks. This one was taller and darker than the boy gathering the berries and was obviously older. He peered out around a large boulder near the edge of the bank and watched the younger one below, who was now about halfway up the bank, his moccasined feet slipping in the gravel as he reached out for some plump, ripe berries. The lad behind the boulder above stepped back, leaned against the big rock, and started pushing it, letting it rock back and forth as he tried to dislodge it. "What's he trying to?" Tom said, not really asking a question. He knew full well what was happening, for it was obvious that the older Apache boy meant deliberate harm to the one on the bank. "Don't worry about it," Little Bill said. "None of our business. Besides, if one Injun wants to get rid of another, I say let him do it, and there's one less redskin around." "I think we should warn that kid," Tom said, ignoring Little Bill's remarks. "Looks like we're a little late for that, brother," Little Bill chuckled. At that moment, the big boulder dislodged and started to roll down the bank, taking an avalanche of gravel with it. The young boy on the bank jerked his head upward in response to the noise of the rolling rock and gravel stones. His eyes widened with fear, and he threw himself sideways, trying to dodge the path of impending disaster. He fell back as he jerked sideways and began to slide and roll down the embankment. The fusillade of debris waved over him as he rolled up short near the foot of the bank, a foot-deep pile of gravel having been heaped ahead of his descent, and more rolling over his legs, burying them deep enough that he could no longer move. The large boulder itself had lodged against the foot of the bank, and one corner of it had rolled over the lad's feet, pinning him down securely. Tom and Little Bill could see the frustration in the older boy's face as he stood there on top of the ridge and gazed down at his failed attempt. He shook his dark head and stalked away, probably hoping the boy would die eventually, trapped in this lonely prison of dirt. "Come on, Little Bill," Tom urged. "We've got to go help him." "Not me, little brother," Little Bill protested. "I ain't helping no Injun. If you want to, go ahead, but I'm going home." "Fine," Tom said, disgruntled. He pulled Little Bill from his saddle and shoved the canvas bag full of game toward his brother. "Here, take this with you." "You gonna make me carry everything back alone?" he protested. "Your choice," Tom said flatly, dropping the sack at his brother's feet. "See you back at the lair." He climbed into the saddle and started down the hill. Little Bill grimaced and sighed resolutely. "Crazy bugger," he oathed to himself, then picked up the canvas bag, turned, and headed for home. The Indian boy was half buried in gravel and was passed out when Tom reached him and knelt before the still body. He placed his fingers under the Indian boy's nose and felt a faint wisp of breath. Good. He was still alive. Tom used the stock of his rifle as a makeshift shovel and dragged the deepest part of the stone pile away from the youth's body. Once he had cleared the most of it, he went to work with his hands so he would not hurt the lad as he cleared the rest of the debris. When enough had been removed, Tom tried to lift the boy free. He was able to roll him onto one shoulder, lift him enough to slide his own knee under the youth and prop him up, but his feet were still pinned by the boulder. Tom removed his canteen that had been slung over his shoulder and rode beneath his left arm while out hunting. He sloshed a little on the boy's dark face, trying to revive him. Finally, the boy stirred in his arms. His mouth opened partially, and his eyes began to twitch. Tom lowered the mouth of the canteen opening to the boy's lips and poured a trickle into his mouth. The lad coughed on it at first, then instinctively started to drink and swallow eagerly. After a couple of swallows, Tom pulled back on the canteen. The boy's hands reached upward, gripping empty air, and his eyes opened. He squirmed suddenly, shocked at the sight of a white face inches from his own, fear and anger welling up in his dark eyes. "Hold it, just hold it," Tom urged quietly and calmly. "I'm here to help you." He wiggled again against Tom's grasp. Tom pushed the canteen back into the boy's face, urging him to take it and hoping the boy would see it as a peace offering. The boy grabbed it eagerly and drank thirstily. This time, Tom let him go at it. Let him keep control of the canteen. "Just take it easy, and I'll get you free from this rock," Tom said, hoping the boy could understand him, as he stepped back away from the youth and turned his attention to the boulder. As he examined where the big rock pinned the Indian's foot, he could see that the foot had been buried by debris first, before the rock rolled on it. Hopefully, this had cushioned the boy's foot somewhat. He scraped away at the gravel, digging down underneath the foot. When he had cleared a large pocket, he glanced at the boy. "This may hurt some," he said. The young Apache glared at him silently, hate burning in his eyes. Gently and steadily, Tom pulled at the boy's leg. He heard the young Indian groan with pain and saw his young face twist with torture. Resolutely, Tom continued to pull until the foot slid free. He let the boy writhe in the dirt until the pain subsided and he was once again able to open his clenched eyes. Then the boy hungrily attacked the canteen, gulping large swallows and breathing heavily. Tom examined the boy's leg and ankle. No bones seemed to be broken, but the ankle was swelling badly. He pulled off the boy's moccasins, and the boy gasped with pain. His feet were also swelling, and it was hard to tell if any of the small bones were broken. Tom pulled his hunting knife from its sheath, and the Indian growled a warning in Apache at him. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to cut your pants leg away from you, so it won't be so constricting." The boy went silent and relaxed a little as he saw Tom slice a slit in the fabric, then sheath his knife in his belt. "Do you understand English?" Tom asked, hopefully. No answer. The boy just stared sullenly. "Do you have a horse nearby?" Still no reply. Tom had not seen one, but that did not mean the boy couldn't have one tethered someplace out of sight. "Look," Tom pleaded, "if you understand me, you've got to talk to me. I only want to help. If you have one, I need to get you on it. You won't be able to walk on your own for a while." Still, the boy just glared. "Well, you can't stay here," Tom muttered with frustration. "I'll just have to put you on my horse." He rose and started toward the youth. The boy cringed back and shook his head, the long black hair whipping in the slight breeze. "So you do know what I'm saying? Good. Tell me where your home is and I'll take you there." Tom reached down to lift the boy, and the boy slid backward, eliciting another groan as he disturbed his injured leg and foot. "See, you'll just hurt yourself if you don't let me help." He pulled the lad to his feet, lifting him quickly, hoping to keep the weight off his leg as much as possible. The boy gritted his teeth and tried to stifle any sound that might indicate that he was hurting. In one full swoop, Tom swung the young Apache into the saddle. He kept the pony's reins wrapped around one wrist and pulled tight, just in case the boy could manage to bolt the horse forward and take off on his own. He had doubted that the boy could do it, but he didn't dare take any chances. He was right. The boy landed firmly in the saddle and remained still, obviously hurting a great deal from the movement. Tom swung up behind the saddle and prodded the horse in the flanks. It started forward seemingly aimlessly at first because Tom was not directing him in any particular direction. "Which way?" Tom asked over the boy's shoulder. No answer. "Guess I'll just have pick it myself. You can save us a lot of time if tell me." Still no answer. "All right," Tom said, pulling the reins and turning his mount toward the east, and started forward. They had gone but a few yards when the young Indian squirmed and pointed to the left. "That way," he said. Tom smiled and turned his horse northward. They rode several miles into the mountains. The boy pointed the way occasionally, but still refrained from talking. After about a half hour, Tom reined beside a mountain spring. He stepped down and pulled the boy from the saddle and set him gently on the ground next to the pool of cold water. They rested here for a while, the boy's feet and ankles dangling in the cold swirl of the spring. Tom soaked his bandana and swabbed the lad's legs gently. The boy closed his eyes and relished the relief. When he finally opened them again, he glanced up at Tom. The anger and hatred seemingly subsided, and his eyes began to brighten. "I am called Hawk," the boy said, taking Tom by surprise. Tom smiled and offered his hand. "Good to know you, Hawk. My name is Tom." The boy did not take his hand, but his lips cracked into half a mile. Tom, knowing he shouldn't push his luck too fast, withdrew his hand and nodded that he understood the boy's reluctance. By the time the boys had rested and remounted, they were beginning to get along. Tom was careful not to pry too much into Hawk's business, and although he had seen the other Apache that tried to kill Hawk, he was reluctant to tell him what he had seen and refrained from asking him if he knew what had actually happened and who it was that wanted to harm him. The two boys were finally getting to know each other when they rode out of the narrow canyon into the wide meadow just south of the Mogollon Mountains, which peeked into a sawtooth edge against the distant horizon. The meadow was filled with teepees and wickiups. The village was a beehive of activities, with women and children working in gardens and tending to the mundane chores of curing buffalo hides and making clothing. Fires poured smoke into the clear blue sky as many of the squaws attended the cooking pots. Tom had never been in an Indian village before and was impressed by the industriousness of the tribe. He had heard so many stories from the members of the gang about lazy Indians and their savagery, but what he saw here was a civilization and a way of life. They were people, like any other people, going about the business of making a living and providing for themselves. Away from the teepees, gathered in a circle, Tom could see several warriors sitting in what looked like a tribal conference. The hackles on the back of his neck prickled, and a cold shudder skittered along his spine as he saw one of the warriors point toward him. Heads turned, and there was a disturbing murmur of voices. The seated warriors suddenly stood, and the group marched toward the center of camp. The women and children had momentarily ceased their work and stared at the horse approaching with the white boy and Indian youth riding double. A middle-aged squaw made her way through the throng of spectators. She was extremely thin, gaunt was more the description, and her raven hair, now streaked with strands of gray, draped the sides of her lean, tired face. The whites around her dark eyes were prominent, and her skin was not so dark as the other members of the tribe. She shouted something in Apache, and young Hawk responded as she ran up beside them. Her gaze fixed on Hawk's ripped pants leg and the swollen ankle and foot. Again, she spoke in Apache. This time, more concern and urgency in her voice. By now, the warriors of the tribe had gathered around. Tom felt mighty uneasy from the stares. Seeing Tom's discomfort and the mistrust of his own people, Hawk spoke in English. "This is my mother, Lone Sparrow," he said. Then to his mother he said, "This is my friend." He pointed to Tom. "He helped me when I was hurt." Hawk's mother looked up at him, still a little distrustful, and wondering what had happened. Although he had spoken to his mother in English, which indicated that she understood, Hawk quickly rattled off a lengthy dissertation in Apache so the elders and braves could understand as well. Tom wondered if he was telling anyone about the other Indian boy who had rolled the rock down on him. Did Hawk even know that someone had deliberately tried to harm him? The tribal leaders began to mumble among themselves as Hawk started to slide off the pony's back. Tom stopped him, slid to the ground first, and helped the boy down, supporting him somewhat so his feet would not have to take his whole weight. His mother stepped to his side and took him under one arm to help. Hawk limped a step or two. He smiled a little, feeling his strength coming back and reassuring him that the pain was subsiding. "Thank you for helping my son," she said, as she looked into Tom's face. Her breath almost caught for a second, and she felt a strange affinity to this young man. You are very kind." Her words spaced out as she stared into his gray eyes, thinking there was something strangely familiar and somehow even haunting about this young white man. Tom was feeling something strange also, and shifted shyly back and forth on his feet, feeling awkward, yet something else. Suddenly, her attention was distracted as one of the warriors stepped forward and touched her arm. He said something in Apache. His eyes were piercing, and his nostrils flared. Whatever he was saying, it sounded like anger. The squaw babbled something back, sounding almost defiant. He answered back in disgust, then turned and walked back toward the other warriors. I am sorry. My husband, Natchez, says you must go. Please do not be offended. It is his way. It is not mine, and I would like for you to stay, but whites are not welcome here by the elders. It is best that you go, before it becomes dangerous for you. Please know I am thankful to you." Tom nodded and tipped his hat to her. "I understand," he said. Then to Hawk, "Think you can stand on your own now?" He started to step back and release his grip on the young man's arm. "Yes, I am much better now. Besides, my mother will help me," Hawk said with a smile. "But wait, before you go, please take this as a token of my thanks." He lifted a beaded necklace from around his neck. There was a wooden carving of a bird at its center. Eagle or hawk, Tom thought. Probably a hawk. "Thank you," Tom almost stammered, hardly knowing what to say, and took it from the boy, knowing that to refuse it would be to insult him. "I will wear it proudly." He removed his hat and started to lift the necklace to his head. "Wait," Lone Sparrow said, and stepped forward, taking the necklace from him. She had to reach high, and Tom had to bend slightly and lower his head for her to place it around his neck. As she settled it in place, Tom lifted his chin and found himself staring into the dark pools of her eyes, their faces inches from each other. There was a softness, almost of wistfulness in her gaze, and she smiled warmly. Tom half smiled, a strange sensation waving over him, and he straightened up, stepping back toward his mount and placing his hat back on his head. "Goodbye," he almost choked it out, turned swiftly, climbed into the saddle, neck-reined his horse back around to face the way they had ridden in. He kicked his mount in the ribs sharply, whipped him with the reins, and sent him galloping off across the meadow toward the mountains from whence he had come. Chapter 4. The Apaches had kept the Southwest in turmoil, now for almost 25 years, while Bill Noonan's gang rode rampant over the Southwest. Tom and Little Bill had grown to adulthood and now rode with the gang regularly. Bill had taught the boys much and leaned on them heavily for support, now that Sid Denglard was getting old and not quite as sharp or even as capable physically as he had once been. Bill still looked to Sid for his advice, and Sid always rode on the raids, even if he only stayed in the saddle while the others went into the banks and express offices. Tom Noonan had grown to his full height of just below 6 feet, now at 23, and was a capable young man. Very good with a gun and horse, but he lacked the native ruthlessness needed when on a job. Little Bill, on the other hand, had grown to be a tall, imposing figure of a man. He excelled with a pistol, and he liked using it. He took to bank robbery like a natural. For years now, the Noonan gang had continued to ride roughshod over the Southwest. Their only real competition seemed to be the marauding Apaches. The great Apache leader named Goyathley, meaning one who yawns, kept the army at bay with his daring raids. He had hated the whites intensely since his wife, his mother, and 3 young children were murdered by Spanish troops from Mexico in 1858. His hatred was so strong that it spread to all whites, not just the Spanish. He took every opportunity to terrorize settlements, wagon trains, and homesteaders, wreaking havoc on both sides of the border. His name became legend. No longer Goyathley, but the feared and infamous battle leader known as Geronimo. His exploits kept the Southwest ever vigilant. No one knew when Geronimo would strike next. At times, the Apache would seem to have settled down, and then, without warning, the war drums and the battle paint would once again begin. Geronimo's exploits were many times a fortunate diversion for Bill Noonan's gang. At other times, the marauding Indians would be just another obstacle in their way, while trying to elude sheriffs and posses. Over the years, the Noonan gang often returned to the Southwest, hitting a town quickly, robbing a bank or express office, and escaping quickly, leaving the law at the disadvantage of having to trail them through Apache country. Of course, this also posed additional dangers to the gang, but shooting it out with Indians did not damage their reputation as much as if they shot it out with the law. The gang had hit Las Cruces early in the morning of May 12, 1878, relieving the bank of an excess of $50,000. Bill and Little Bill had simply walked into the bank, while Tom, Sid, and Charlie watched the street. And before the town law could be notified, the bandits rode casually out of town before putting their mounts into a gallop and headed northeast into the hills. Bill Noonan was feeling good about this morning's work and was pleased that it had gone off without a hitch. There had been no need for violence, and except for the banker's chagrin, no one had been hurt. His elation soon dissipated as they rode further up into the hills. Near noon, they began to see smoke signals, and there was the sound of war drums in the distance. The Apache was once more on the prod. Shortly after noon, as they rode out of the hills onto the expansive flatness of the New Mexico desert, they spotted a war party of about a dozen warriors. They were silhouetted against the clear blue sky as they sat atop their horses, spread out in a long line across the mesa to the north. Little Bill saw them first, reining his horse up sharply and bumping into his father's mount with urgency and surprise. "Yeah, I see them," Bill said almost casually, trying not to show his concern, and failing miserably. The hackles on the back of his neck bristled, and he felt like he could smell death in the air. "We keep on riding, steadily, just as we have been. Don't panic, and don't let on that we see them." He had no sooner uttered these words when the war party faded back and disappeared behind the skyline of the mesa. "Where'd they go?" Tom asked. "Think they've gone?" "Wouldn't count on it," Sid muttered around his cud of chewing tobacco, then spit to the side with some of the spittle seeping into his already tobacco-stained, bristly gray beard. "Most likely they're just taking a back trail down from the mesa. I'm betting we'll know in about 3 minutes." It didn't take that long, however, for as soon as he said it, Sid saw them emerge from the base of the mesa. Wild yells and war whoops filled the air, and dust billowed up around the pounding hooves of the warriors' horses as they kicked them into action and galloped after the small band of outlaws. The 5 gang members whipped their horses with the reins and spurred them into a full gallop. Bill Noonan had wished that they had had the foresight to rest their horses earlier, but fear of a posse being formed and in pursuit of them had precluded them from taking the time. The Indians were still quite a ways back, and hopefully their horses would tire before they caught up to the bandits. But as they galloped on, the outlaws' horses began to falter. Lather foamed over their chests and flanks, and their breathing became labored. The sound of the approaching Indians became louder, indicating that the war party was fast gaining on them. The outlaws' furtive glances behind them verified it was so, prompting them to punish their horses further, trying to get every ounce of strength and distance out of them. As the war party advanced to within rifle range, the warriors that had them began to fire. Hot lead burned across the rump of Charlie's horse, and he bucked violently, kicking his hind legs out from under him and almost nosing the desert sand as he bent his head downward and between his front legs. Charlie slid in the saddle, almost falling out, but managed to hang on and eventually bring his mount under control. But he had lost ground and was now behind the rest of the gang, the Indians gaining on him rapidly. At first, none of the others noticed what had happened, but then, as Tom Noonan glanced back to see how close their attackers were, he saw Charlie struggling with his horse. "Charlie!" Tom shouted instinctively. He pulled rein hard, and his horse wheeled around, all 4 legs sliding in the loose sand. The scene before him played out in a blur in slow motion, all at the same time. The band of Apaches were barreling down on Charlie, the lead warrior, riding without holding reins, hands free to wield a Winchester repeating rifle that was aimed directly at the aging outlaw. As Tom came around, he pulled his 6 gun from its holster and fired without taking time for deliberate aim. The warrior fell backwards, arms outstretched in the air, his rifle flying skyward, as Tom's bullet hit its mark in the middle of the Indian's bare chest. His horse seemed to gallop out from under him, and the warrior landed on his back in the sand, with his companions trying to avoid his body as they continued their pursuit. Charlie, with his horse under control, reined his horse around and sent him racing after his companions, who had now realized what was happening and were pulling at their horses' reins, slowing down and half turning to face the raging Apaches. Bill and Sid had their pistols out and firing into the melee as Tom started to turn back to follow Charlie. Little Bill swung his mount wide of the gang, dragging his Winchester from its scabbard and taking the reins between his teeth. He raised the weapon to shoulder level, sighting across the gleaming barrel, and squeezed the trigger as fast as he could lever shells into the chamber. Methodically, from left to right, he pumped bullets into the marauding Indians, felling 4 of them in as many seconds. The remaining warriors tried to pull up sharply and sent their mounts into a frenzy, stirring up great clouds of dust. Bill and Sid added to the fire with their pistols, and 2 more redskins hit the ground. Apaches were fierce warriors, and cowardice was not one of their traits. But they were not stupid. They always knew when it was prudent to retreat in the face of defeat. It was always better to fight another time. What was left of the war party faded back, then turned and rode back the way they came. Even though the Apaches had retreated and the gang's horses were spent, the Noonans knew better than to hang around. Without a word to one another, they pushed their mounts onward across the desert as fast as possible. The band of outlaws steadily rode northeastward toward Colorado for the rest of the afternoon. That night, the Noonans found a place to hole up for the night. It was a secluded spot among several large rocks and boulders scattered about at the base of a low bluff that cast early afternoon shade as the setting sun went down behind it. There was water and some grass, though sparse there. When they had found this spot toward the end of the day, they had decided not to push their luck and to make camp early, even though there were still a few hours of daylight left. The men and the horses were beat, and they needed the rest. Especially the horses. It had been a wonder that they had not lost a single mount, given the way the horses had been mistreated. The weary band settled down for the night. They took turns keeping one man on watch while the others slept. The war drums in the distance kept up their monotonous beating well into the night before ceasing to a silent, ominous warning of impending danger. A few hours before dawn, the party saddled up and rode out of their temporary sanctuary, getting an early start and keeping to shadows and off skylines, as well as avoiding open areas as much as possible. They rode on through the chill of early morning and into the sweltering heat of mid-morning. The sun, having had now risen above the peaks of the Mogolans and exploding into a brilliant orb. So far they had seen nor heard anything of the Apache. But that did not mean the Apache had not seen them, for when an Apache could not be seen, that was the time one should be most wary. As the riders began to ride up out of the desert into higher country, keeping close to the base of a buttress of shale rock to their right, they made their way through a narrow pass which took them to a precipice where they would be able to see for miles ahead. Once again, they would be heading into open territory. But at least they would be able to purvey the area far enough ahead to see what dangers may be lurking there. They reined up sharply as they neared the precipice, Bill Noonan raising his hand to signal the rest to a halt. As the sound of their horses' hoofs on the sliding stone and the sounds of creaking leather and chinking of trappings ceased, they listened intently. Bill had thought he had heard it, but now that they were all sitting silent, it was plain. The sound of guns were booming in the distance and firing in rapid succession. There seemed to be a lot of them. The outlaw band looked warily to each other. No one said a word as they shucked rifles from their saddle scabbards. Holding the rifles with one hand, stocks propped against the saddle and barrels pointed skyward, the men, carefully and slowly, rode forward, keeping their mounts at a silent, steady walk toward the precipice. As they neared the opening, Bill motioned for them to halt and dismounted. The others followed suit, leaving the horses ground hitched with trailing reins. They bent low to keep from being skylined and crept forward until they could peer over the top and gaze down into the valley below. From here, they could see a vast rolling expanse of flat land. Sid rolled his tobacco cud and said with disgust and awe, "What the devil are those fools doing out here in Apache country?" Down below was a wagon train. There were about 20 wagons, and they had formed a circle, creating a barricade and keeping their stock inside. Men lay prone beneath wagons, and others crouched with rifle barrels slung over wagon tongues, firing at the war party that had attacked them and was riding and shooting as they circled the caravan. This was a much bigger party than the Noonans had met up with the day before. More of them had rifles, although many still used only bows and arrows. Several of the wagons were on fire from flaming arrows, and there were bodies of men, women, and children strewn about the inside perimeter of the train, with arrows protruding from them. The protectors of the train had brought down several warriors as they had openly and blatantly rode close to the wagons, but clearly the settlers were losing the fight as more and more riflemen fell mortally wounded from enemy fire. "We going to help them?" Tom asked, looking to Sid and his father. "What? And let them know we're here?" Charlie Noonan rasped. "We'd be fools too if we horned in." Bill Noonan glared at Charlie with his usual disappointment, then grimaced, turned, levered around into his Winchester, and fired. An Apache with a full headdress fell from his saddle. Sid shrugged. "Guess we're fools," he said as he slung his rifle forward under him and started firing. The others followed suit, and soon the air was totally filled with the sound of booming guns. At first, neither the attacking Apaches nor the defending settlers noticed that a new force had joined into the fray. But as Indian ponies started dumping bodies in rapid succession, the attackers soon realized they had been caught in a crossfire and started to pull back and retreat. The wagon train men, now realizing that they had help and the Apaches were now caught at a disadvantage, began to rally with new hope and aggressiveness, levering their weapons and firing even faster than they had before. The force of the war party had suddenly dwindled drastically, with red bodies littering the ground. The remaining warriors danced their mounts around, falling back, kicking up dust and firing, their attention split between the two forces of returning fire. Then, seeing the futility of the situation, they wheeled their ponies and rode off beyond the western horizon. The Noonans were on their feet by now, still firing their weapons at the retreating marauders. Charlie laughed gleefully as he stepped forward, repeatedly pulling the trigger and spilling additional braves from the backs of their horses as they retreated. The men from the wagon train continued to fire, but as the Indians rode farther on, the firing slowed to a sporadic crescendo until the sound of rifle fire ceased altogether. Bill sighed with relief and ceased firing. "That'll do, Charlie," he shouted over the booming of his uncle's firing. Charlie kept on, ignoring Bill as if he didn't hear him, which he probably didn't, so absorbed was he in shooting redskins. Tom reached out and pulled the barrel of Charlie's rifle downward. A slug buried itself in the dirt just ahead of the old man's feet. I said, "That'll do, they've had enough," Bill repeated. Charlie glared at him, his eyes glazed over, and then, as if returning to a sense of reality, they lightened up, and he said, "Dang, I was just getting pumped up." "We'd better get down there to the wagon before those red devils decide to come back," Sid warned. "But we put them on the run, Sid," Little Bill said. "For now," Sid retorted. "They usually attack in waves. If so, they know we're here this time and will send a separate force after us. It's best if we hole up with the wagon train. We'll have better fortification there." "Then we'd better get moving," Bill Noonan said, turning and heading back for his horse. The band of outlaws wasted no time in saddling up and riding down the bank toward the open ground below. They had just ridden out onto the plain into the open, with the train still a distance off, when, both, the southern and western horizons came alive with galloping horses and wildly yelling Apaches. They were back in a larger force this time, attacking from two directions, in order to cover both the wagon train and the interlopers who had spoiled the last attack. The gang kicked their horses into a full gallop, spreading out almost single file as they rode hell-bent for the wagons. The men from the wagons were firing again now, shooting over the heads of the oncoming riders and providing some cover. The riders drew their 6 guns, half-turned in the saddle, and fired haphazardly, hoping to keep the oncoming attackers somewhat at bay. But it seemed to do no good. The attacking force was swooping down on them too fast. They stopped the return fire and turned their total attention on riding for sanctuary in the confines of the wagon circle. Tom Noonan was trailing a bit behind, his mount faltering as an arrow buried itself into the horse's left flank. Then, with a crash, the animal fell, spilling Tom from the saddle. He landed with a thud on the hard-packed ground, driving wind from his lungs and sending pain up his entire right side. He rolled instinctively, coming up into a half-sitting position. A brave was riding down on him, bow and arrow poised to shoot him. Tom brought his pistol up and fired point blank, taking the Indian full in the chest. The warrior fell from horseback just feet away and in front of the young outlaw. Tom skittered aside to miss the oncoming horse, started to rise, and was halfway to his feet when he was thrown backward with tremendous force and pain seared through his upper right shoulder, blood spurting from the hollow just beneath his clavicle and spread into a crimson circle around the arrow embedded there. The Apache that had just shot him was almost on top of him now, his paint pony barreling past him. The warrior leaned from the horse's back, dropping his bow and diving onto the injured outlaw. It was all a blur to young Tom Noonan as the savage came down violently on him, pushing him flat to the ground while a horde of Indian ponies rushed closely past the rolling duo. The warrior's painted face loomed an inch above Tom's, and the young man could feel his attacker's hot breath and smell the grease that had been plastered over his body and mixing with his sweat. The Apache's dark eyes were piercing with savage menace, and as his left arm held the outlaw's body down, his right hand raised the knife high, arcing it for a swift blow to his captive's heart. Then, as if time stood still, the brave seemed to freeze in place, his gleaming weapon held high, as he caught sight of the beaded necklace with the hawk amulet hanging around Tom Noonan's neck and spilling out of his open shirt. The warrior's eyes focused on it in surprise. Then, with a lunge, he brought the knife straight downward. The outlaw cringed, clenching his eyes shut, waiting and ready for the slicing blade to tear the life from him. But it didn't come. The blade slashed past his head and drove hilt deep into the dirt. As Tom opened his eyes, the savage was ripping the necklace from around his neck. "Don't move until we are gone." "Now we are even," he heard the Indian growl between clenched teeth. "Next time, we are enemies." He pushed himself upright and away from the fallen bandit. He caught up his pony, swung aboard, and rode away from the war zone and disappeared over the western horizon. By now, the rest of the gang had made it to the wagons, jumping their horses over the wagon tongues that separated the parked Conestogas. They had leaped to the ground, dragging their rifles from the saddles and letting their mounts run on inside the circle, quickly taking their places beside the wagon train protectors and starting to pour lead into the attacking Indians. It was only now that they had realized that Tom was not with them then. When they finally spotted the young man, they saw that he was in trouble and had gone down, with an attacking warrior on top of him and slashing away with his knife before jumping to his feet, leaving Tom lying still on the ground while he swung aboard his pony and rode away. They turned their fire toward this one Apache, but he had ridden out of range. With red-hot anger, Tom's companions fired rapidly and viciously into the sea of red bodies. Rifle barrels ran hot as painted savages fell to the ground with their ponies running aimlessly and riderless. By God, these red devils were going to have to pay for what they had done to Tom. Chapter 5. The light was intense, although it flickered with expansion and contraction. At first, it seemed as if this glowing orb was all there was in the universe, but gradually it seemed to recede, becoming just a part of the surrounding darkness. As young Tom Noonan tried to focus his eyes open, the brilliance of the light seemed to make them ache. He blinked the lids closed and half opened them again, this time letting the light seep in slowly. Gradually, he forced his eyes open, staring into the light. After a few moments, his eyes started to adjust, and as they focused, he could see that the light was the flame of a lantern hanging by a hook above him. As the darkness faded into the light, his surroundings became more clear, although just shadows and shades of light. "So, you're awake." The voice was deep, calm, and reassuring. A face came forward through the shadows and loomed above the young outlaw's head. It was a long, narrow face with a sharp, pointy chin. "You've been out for quite some time," the man said, leaning closer and placing his warm hand on Tom's forehead. "I don't think you have a fever, but you've had a nasty wound, and I'm afraid you'll be off your feet for a while." As the man leaned forward, Tom could see that he was an older man. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, and his thinning hair above a high forehead was still mostly dark. What little streaks of gray there were around the temples were not noticeable in the light of the lantern. Where?" Tom began to struggle and tried to ask where he was, but the kindly man merely pushed him back gently on the mattress he was lying on. "You're in my wagon," the elder said. "I took the arrow out of your shoulder and bandaged you up." Tom moved his shoulder a bit. He felt the constricting tightness of the dressing mail, and he became suddenly aware of the dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder. "You a doctor?" Tom muttered, still a bit incoherent. "No, but I was a medic during the war. Patched up a lot of Yankee bullet holes. Name's Joshua Trent. This is my wagon you're in." Tom could now see the hoops and billowed canvas surrounding him and curving above into an arcing ceiling. The flickering glow from the outside campfires filtered through the fabric and cast a ghostly cloud about him. He could hear voices and activity bustling about the wagon camp outside. "The Apaches?" Tom suddenly remembered and stirred with a start. "They're gone," Trent said. "Thanks to you and your friends, we drove them off." Are they?" Tom tried to choke it out, almost not daring to ask. "Your friends are fine, if that's what you're worried about," the kindly gentleman said. "But they are worried about you. You were left out there for dead. It's a wonder those heathens didn't lift your scalp." Tom suddenly remembered the painted face of the savage Indian that pinned him to the ground, coming at him with a knife. The Indian should have killed him right then and there. But why didn't he? He seemed to remember an echo like a hollow gurgle in his ears. His fingers probed for the necklace he usually wore. It wasn't there, but Joshua Trent had probably removed it before treating him. But then again, there was something else. He wished he could remember. Then, as the fleeting thought disappeared, he heard Trent say, "I'd better tell your dad and the others that you've come around. I'll have my wife bring you something to eat." He faded back into the darkness, and then his shadow reappeared outlined, for a moment, against the camp-lit nighttime sky that filled the high-hooped entrance of the big Conestoga as he stepped down. Another shadow almost immediately filled the opening as Bill Noonan climbed into the wagon. "Thought we lost you out there, son," he said, sitting down and leaning over the young man. The outlaw leader's face was still etched with grimness, with a faint smile of relief sneaking through. "Would have put us a man short," he tried to joke and pretend that was his only worry. "It would have left you with a bigger cut. Sorry to disappoint you." Tom forced a chuckle. "I wasn't going to give you your share anyhow, kid, seeing as how you didn't pull your weight against those damned Apaches," Bill quipped. Then, turning serious, "What the hell happened out there anyhow?" I'm not really sure, Tom stammered. Whatever it was, that Redskin got back on his pony and lit out of there like the devil himself was after him. You mean he ran from the battle, like a coward? That's what it looked like. Tom pondered that for a moment. Couldn't be. That was one dangerous savage. Doesn't make sense. He stopped suddenly, as if remembering something. What? What is it, son? Noonan asked. I don't know, Dad, he answered amid his confusion. There was something, but I just can't quite remember. He laid back against the mattress. Maybe later, he murmured. Tom Noonan awakened again just as dawn was beginning to break, and the camp was once again alive with activity. Mrs. Trent had brought him some broth the night before, and then he had drifted back to sleep for the night. He was now wide awake. His shoulder still ached dully as he squirmed beneath the blanket. He now remembered the battle with the Indians and the Apache that had failed to take his life. He remembered the warrior had taken the necklace from around his neck and telling him to lie still. But why? He was still pondering this when he felt the wagon bob on its springs as someone climbed into the wagon. He pushed himself up on his elbows. He saw the skirts flip over the wagon seat. Mrs. Trent? He asked. No, a younger feminine voice said, as she came through the hooped opening. She was carrying a tin plate and cup. My ma sent me to bring you your breakfast. She came close and sat beside him. Flapjacks and coffee's about all we have for breakfast, she said. That'll do just fine, Tom said, pushing himself to a higher position, almost sitting. Where's your ma? He queried, venturing forward the start of a conversation. He had not seen any young girls close to his own age in quite a long time. In fact, he had hardly ever seen a girl, and this girl seemed nice and bright. She was no raving beauty, but she was definitely attractive, with brown eyes and long brown hair pulled back into a bun and tied with a blue ribbon. She's helping with hitching up of the teams. She smiled as she gave him his breakfast plate. Then, with a blush, she said, I'm Julie Trent. My name's Tom, he said, starting to cut his flapjacks. I know, she said. Then, thinking she spoke too quickly, she added shyly, my folks told me. Tom put down his knife and gazed up at her and smiled without a word. She returned the smile. The wagons had been rolling steadily since sunup. Bill Noonan and Sid Denglard rode their horses, one on each side of the lead wagon. Charlie and Little Bill rode as outriders, one on each side of the trail several hundred yards ahead of the train, keeping watch and ready to give out advance warning of any impending dangers. So far, they had seen no sign of Apaches, no smoke signals, and no sound of war drums. But no one thought for a moment that they were out of danger. The Apache was well known for lulling their prey into a false sense of security and then attacking with sudden surprise. We're beholden to you gents for helping us out like this, Sam Larkin said from his perch on the wagon seat, shouting over the creaking of the swaying Conestoga, the crunch of wagon wheels against the rocky ground, and the plodding clatter of horses' hooves. I don't know what we would have done if you fellers hadn't have come along, like you did. Don't thank us, Sam, Bill Noonan shouted back to the heavy-set wagon master on the wagon boot. He was resting his bandaged left leg against the footrest, while his cook sat next to him on the bench, handling the reins and tooling the double team expertly. Don't forget, those redskins were after us too. We thank you for letting us trail along while my boy gets better. The wagon master chewed on the end of his drooping white walrus mustache. Just the same, we're all glad you came along. Up ahead, Charlie and Little Bill had suddenly reined up. Little Bill whipped his mount around and galloped back toward the train. Dust spewed up from the horse's hoofs as Little Bill brought him to a sliding halt just in front of the train. The wagons pulled to a halt as Sam Larkin bellowed out the command to stop. Riders up ahead, Little Bill said excitedly, kicking up a lot of dust. Apaches? Bill asked, reaching for the stock of his rifle. Can't tell, but maybe not. Patches don't usually come out so open. Little Bill threw a glance back over his shoulder. The cloud of dust loomed closer, and riders were becoming faintly visible. Bill swallowed hard, fear creeping up his spine as he began to make out the shapes emerging from the cloud. The approaching horde was most definitely not Indians. He should have been relieved at that. He was sure, however, that the wagon train would be pleased to see the blue uniformed men riding this way. But for an outlaw on the run, it would be most uncomfortable to be in the company of the U.S. cavalry. Bill Noonan could hear his son laughing and heard the giggling of a young girl inside the parked Conestoga as he stepped out of the light of campfires into the shadows near the wagon. He was just about to climb aboard the wagon when Julie Trent emerged from the hooped opening with an empty tin plate, cup, and utensils and started to step down toward the ground. Bill stepped back quickly out her way as she stepped down. She blushed slightly, pushing a wisp of hair back to the side. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't see you standing there." "My fault entirely, miss," he said, tipping the brim of his broad gray hat. She half smiled, then lowered her lashes and hurried off across the campground. "So, who's the young lady?" Bill said with a bit of tease in his voice as he climbed into the wagon and sat beside his son. "Julie Trent," Tom said. "Her father's been doctoring me." "I suppose she's the prescription," Bill said. He could see that Tom was much better now. He was sitting up, and his face had color to it, noticeable even in the light of the wagon lantern. "Oh, she just brings me my meals," Tom said with indifference. "Sure," Bill said, as if refraining to continue the subject. He grinned. Then it faded, and his voice turned somber and serious. "Did she tell you a cavalry patrol rode in today?" "Yes. She said they were going to accompany the train back to Fort Marcy." "That's right, son," Bill said. "The officer in charge is a Lieutenant Stowe. We've seen him before when we lifted that Army payroll in Tascosa last year. So far, he doesn't seem to recognize us, but I'm afraid if he sees us enough, he just might recall. We've managed to stay out his way most of the day, and it's dark now." He grimaced and added, "It will be a 2-day trek to the fort, and I don't think we should be hanging around that long. For sure, we don't want to be seen at the fort. Besides, that will be backtracking the way we came, and if there is any law on our trail, we could be riding right back to meet them. I think me and the boys should ride out tonight before daylight." "All right," Tom said. "I'll be ready to ride whenever you're ready." Bill shook his head from side to side. "I'm afraid not, son," he said, then added before Tom could protest, "You still need rest. Besides, you'd just slow us up." "You mean you'd leave me behind? Just like that?" "Yeah, just like that." Tom clenched his teeth, and his eyes began to flare with anger. But before he could blurt anything out, Bill placed his hand on the boy's good shoulder and held it reassuringly. "Listen to me, boy. You stay with the train. Ride back to Fort Marcy. You'll get a real doctor's care there. The train is going to lay over for a few days to make sure the Apaches aren't rampaging. Then a military escort will accompany the train to Santa Fe. That will take more than a week, and by that time you should be well enough to ride. Then you can head back to Wolf's Lair, and we'll meet you there. But no buts about it. This is the plan, and I'm still boss of this outfit. You do as I say." Then he winked, and with a chuckle, he added, "I'm sure you will be able to find something to do that will make the trip pleasant." Morning came, and the train was well on its way, before Lieutenant Stowe noticed that Bill Noonan and his companions were gone. Sam Larkin explained that they had decided to leave because their business was in the opposite direction than the fort. They had left during the night to try to make up for some of the time they had lost helping out the settlers. Larkin had escorted the riders past the guards himself. The lieutenant seemed to accept the story, but his brow had wrinkled a bit with consternation. The day wore on without incident, and as sundown approached, the train found a valley with green grass and water. Here they would camp for the night. If all went well, the next day, they should be at the fort for their next encampment. The wagons had been circled. The teams had been unhitched and corralled in a makeshift rope remuda, inside the circle with the rest of the stock. The soldiers had been posted on guard outside the train, covering the entire perimeter, just as they had the previous night. Campfires were being built, and women were busy readying meals. "Rider coming in," a soldier shouted from the south end of the train. Lieutenant Stowe stepped over a wagon tongue between two parked wagons and looked out. Dust billowed around the lone rider and settled down as he rode into the grassy area. Sam Larkin hobbled up beside the young lieutenant. "At least it's only one of them. Don't appear to be Apache neither," he muttered. The rider slowed his horse to a trot and then to a walk as he came closer. Soldiers stepped forward, rifles held high. A corporal shouted the warning to halt and identify himself. The rider complied, and the guards allowed him to ride closer, but at a slow walk. Apparently, the guards were satisfied with the stranger's presence and allowed him to pass. The corporal had pointed toward where Lieutenant Stowe and the wagon master stood. The rider rode forward, and Stowe and Larkin stepped to greet him. The visitor was a big man. Not overly tall, but he was a big man, with huge shoulders and muscles. His middle, while not running to fat, was broad and solid. A short brush of black mustache settled above his thick lips and sagging cheeks, which were not quite jowls, but seemed to turn the ends of his gash of a mouth downward on each end. A battered black range hat settled low over his wide brow, covering his thinning dark hair and revealing only graying sideburns. He was riding a big bay horse, and the badge of a United States Deputy Marshal was pinned haphazardly to his gray shirt near the buttons where it could be seen without being covered by the brown leather vest he wore. He wore a pistol at his left side, butt forward in a cross-draw position. He came forward and stopped in front of his greeters. "My name's Brace Coburn," the lawman said, leaning forward, rising and shifting his bulk in the saddle while hanging onto the saddle horn with both hands. "I've been trailing a gang that held up the bank in Las Cruces 3 days ago." His voice was deep with a trace of raspiness. He seemed to assume that the leaders of the wagon train already knew he was a lawman. "5 of them? Seen anyone like that?" "No, can't say that I have," Larkin was quick to answer. "What about those men that rode out last night?" Stowe quickly put in. Coburn suddenly sat erect. His slitted eyes above the puffy cheeks registered his interest. No, Larkin put in. "Those men were all right. They were family men, I gather. I'm sure they weren't outlaws. They sure helped us out when those redskins jumped us the other day. Besides, there were only 4 of them." Larkin was sure Stowe did not know about the injured boy. "That's right," Stowe said thoughtfully, and obviously beginning to wonder. "There were only 4 of them." "They could have lost one along the way," Coburn mused. "I suppose so," the wagon master agreed. "Can you tell me what they looked like?" Coburn asked. "Well, pretty much ordinary," Larkin answered. 3 older men and a kid. As I say, they sure didn't look nor act like any bad men I ever heard of." "You say they rode out last night?" Coburn asked. Stowe looked expectantly at Larkin. The wagon master shifted his bad leg. "That's right. Left a few hours before dawn. Said with the army here, we didn't need them no more and they had business to attend to." "Which way'd they go?" "North, northeast, seems like. We always point a wagon tongue toward the North Star at night, and that was about the way they went. Leastwise, until they disappeared over the horizon." "They didn't say where they had this business waiting for them?" "No, and I'm not a man who pries into someone else's business. Especially someone who has just helped me out." "You met those men too, Lieutenant?" "Yes, briefly. I was more concerned about the train in general and didn't give them much thought. I did think it strange that they left so suddenly, though, and there did seem to be something familiar about the oldest one. But then again, I get around the territory quite a lot. See a lot of people, yet I don't see them. You know what I mean." Coburn nodded. "Yeah, you don't pay attention," he said brusquely. "Mind if I look around your camp a while? Maybe talk to the other members of the train?" "Oh, sure," Sam Larkin answered. Then where's my manners anyway? He said. Guess I'm getting too old to think, or maybe it's just this bum leg. How about stepping down and having some supper with us? Then I'll show you around. Be obliged, Coburn agreed. Julie Trent was still in the wagon with Tom Noonan after he had finished his supper. Lieutenant Stowe, Sam Larkin, and Brace Coburn could see the shadows of the two young people silhouetted against the canvas by the light of the lantern within as they approached the wagon. Coburn had inspected 3/4 of all the wagons by now and had spoken with many of the travelers. So far, he had not gathered much in the way of new information, but his suspicions were growing, and more he was sure these were the men he was after. A search of wagons only produced the usual contents and a few wounded men who were recuperating from the Indian raid. Julie and Tom's laughter stopped suddenly, and they looked up to see a shadowy figure fill the canvas opening. Sorry to bother you kids, the wagon master said. There's a marshal here with me. No need to get excited. He's just looking around and wants to ask a few questions. His head ducked back, and a larger frame filled the opening as Coburn crawled inside. He seemed to have a little difficulty with his right leg. Tom straightened with a start. His pulse began to race, but he tried to hold his composure. Julie saw paleness wash over Tom's face and was instantly aware that he was afraid. Looking for a gang of bank robbers, Coburn said brusquely as he settled himself next to Julie and Tom. There was little room in the wagon to straighten his leg, and he got to the point right away. There were 4 men here with the train, and they rode on. Did you happen to see or get acquainted with any of them? Before Tom could think of what to say, Julie put in quickly, I know there were some men who helped out when the Apaches attacked us the other day, but I don't know who they were, and I wasn't aware they were no longer with the train. How about you, son? The marshal asked Tom directly. Julie piped up again. He couldn't have, she said much too quickly. He was shot by an Apache arrow before those men arrived, and he's been laid up in this wagon ever since. Coburn sensed the nervousness, and if his narrow eyes could have squinted more, they probably would have. He stared directly at Tom, as if memorizing his face. I'm asking you, boy. Tom swallowed hard, then forced it out. Yeah, that's right. Just like she said. You can see my shoulders bandaged where they took the arrow out. Coburn leaned closer and examined the wound. Looks like you were lucky, he muttered coldly. What's your name, boy? Tom. He started, then hesitated. Tom Nolan. You traveling with anyone? Yes, Julie supplied quickly. He's with us. I mean my parents and I. He's my cousin. Girl, you annoy me. You know that. I'm talking to this boy here. What are you? His ventriloquist. With that, he arose and climbed back out of the wagon. How many more wagons left to check? Tom heard the marshal say outside the wagon. Just 2 more, he heard Sam Larkin answer. Tom seemed to breathe a little easier now. Julie could see the relief, and she smiled reassuringly. Dawn came, and once again, the wagon train rolled on. Tom had slept fitfully through the night, remembering how the big lawman had looked at him and worried about the man's presence. It wasn't until he learned that the marshal had ridden on that he felt fully relieved. As the wagon bumped along the trail, Tom reflected on the last few days. His wound was healing. He was happy whenever Julie came to see him, but he worried about the marshal on the trail of his father and the others. He thought about the Apache who had attacked him and could have killed him, but spared his life instead. As his thoughts faded and he drifted off into a mid-morning nap, he was not aware that 3 years later, destiny would reunite him once again with the same Apache and Marshal Brace Coburn in a strange alliance with death. Part 2. Chapter 6. Marshal Brace Coburn guided his buck